Clare Mulley is an award-winning biographer whose latest book, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, is a dual biography of Hannah Reich and Melita von Stauffenberg, the only two women who actively served the Nazi regime as test pilots during the Second World War. Melita also served the regime as an engineer. Not only did both women defy gender expectations in the Third Reich, but Melita was also part Jewish and escaped persecution by the Nazi regime for being so because they greatly valued her work. Hannah and Melita were both highly accomplished pilots. Hannah in 1937 even became the first female to fly a helicopter. However, the two women, interestingly, did not like each other. Ultimately, the pair lived parallel yet remarkably different lives. As the Nazi war effort neared its end, Melita covertly supported the most famous attempt on Adolf Hitler's life. But Hannah later desperately begged Hitler to let her fly him to safety from his Berlin bunker. Unlike Melita, Hannah held the Nazi worldview and denied the Holocaust more than 30 years after the fall of Nazi Germany. Last month, I interviewed Clare Mulley about her book, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, after reading it for myself. Here is the interview. Clare, could you explain just how much danger both Hannah Reich and Melita von Stauffenberg put themselves in with their test flights during the Nazi war effort?
Yeah, a lot. They're both incredible pilots. They were test pilots, so they're testing prototypes. If I give you a few examples, perhaps. So Hannah Reich, she was a brilliant glider pilot. She set world records before the war that have actually, some of them, not been beaten. She was the first woman in the world to fly a helicopter, and then she flew one inside a building. So she was no stranger to danger. But during the war, it went up to a new level. One of the very earliest things she tested was a glider called the Gigant, which was absolutely massive. Gigant means giant. And it was, I think the wheels were about as tall as her head. And she had to put wooden blocks on the bottom of her shoes to be able to reach the pedals. So, we would never consider it. That would not pass your health and safety today. So that gives you an example, a sort of flavour. She went on famously to fly, among other things, the Messerschmitt 163 Comet rocket plane. She said it was like riding on a cannonball. Although I am not entirely convinced that she flew it under power, the rocket plane. I think she was testing the gliding landings, still incredibly dangerous. Then after that, she tested the V1, so that is the buzz bomb or doodlebug that caused so much destruction across Britain. So she tested a manned version of that, partly an early prototype to do with their steering and so on, but then later on she tested a manned version for potential kamikaze use, but they never actually went into production, those manned versions. So, she was doing incredible work, absolutely terrifying. She was a brilliant pilot, and she was truly, deeply courageous. And Melita von Stauffenberg had that real blunt courage as well. Her story is even more remarkable, really. But you're asking about her courage. So her role, she was a brilliant aeronautical engineer, and she was one of the very few aeronautical engineers to also test her own designs. And so she was involved in the development of the Stuka dive bombers, and later night landings for different planes like the Junker 88s as well. For night interceptors, basically, blind flying skills. But the early work with the Stuka dive bombers should be testing them. If a test pilot did one test, you go down at near vertical levels at high speed, and the G-forces are much that quite often you're red out, so your vision goes red with the blood rushing to your head, and you might well black out, so you lose consciousness. So if a test pilot does a successful test in a prototype Stuka, that's very admirable. If they do it again, they're considered heroic. Now, Melita would do up to 15 tests a single day. It's extraordinary work. Statistically, the odds were completely against her. Several people lost their lives in that test programme. But throughout the war, she undertook over 200 test dives in a Stuka dive bomber, sometimes losing consciousness and managing to regain consciousness just in time to pull out and skim back across the fields. So, incredible work.
Both women were obviously highly capable test pilots in Nazi Germany, as you pointed out there. But unsurprisingly, did face a lot of sexism. How did they deal with that?
Yes, well, they took very different approaches. Of course, the Nazi German regime was hugely sexist, paternalistic. They didn't feel that women's role was in the cockpit at all. But Hannah and Melita were so skilled, they needed their abilities. So they sort of rather begrudgingly let them do the work. Having turned them down, they weren't allowed to wear uniform. They weren't allowed to be in the Luftwaffe. They were effectively civilians who had been seconded to do this test work during the war. Yes, they faced great sexism, of course, both of them. Hannah took considerable affront. She sort of almost a bit of... She certainly addressed it quite vociferously. She made complaints. She had high contacts among the higher echelons of the Nazi party, so she would complain about Nazi macho pride getting in the way of delivering the work that was needed. And she pulled a lot of strings, and that didn't help her either, because she had quite sexist pilots. She was working alongside colleagues, and then they felt that she was going and pulling strings, asking for favours to test the best planes before them. So that didn't help her case. But some of their prejudice was purely to do with gender, and so they would. One of the pilots said that Hannah was like a woman who is. When a new man enters a circle of friends, she can't rest until she sleeps with him. Hannah was like that, but with planes. She needed to get that new plane. And, it's incredibly gendered, sexist language, and that just hints at what she must have been facing all the time. And I know, for example, she would deliberately wear clothes as a sort of defence mechanism against roving arms and hands. So she wore a white Angora jumper, because then the men in uniform, if they were inappropriate trying to grapple with her, they would get white fur all over their uniforms, which was frowned upon. So she had all this sort of coping strategies as well. Melita, a very different approach. She in no way was particularly interested in championing the rights of women. Her focus was very much with the technical work that she was doing. And she, only on one occasion, she tried to stay out of the limelight as much as possible. But on one occasion, she was eventually forced to accept she had to give a public speech. That was in Stockholm. And during that speech, it's wonderful because she never mentions Hitler by name. She never uses the word Nazi. She's quite clearly not doing this triumphant speech that was expected of her at the time. But she does mention gender. And so at one point she says, "We female pilots, we're not suffragettes." She is deliberately not pushing that case. And in fact, that's because she was brought up in those times and she'd internalised that perspective. I mean, she would do this incredible test work. She'd do the engineering work surrounded by male colleagues. She was paid a good salary for it. And then she would go home and she'd put on a pinny and cook lunch and act as secretary to her academic husband, because that was the wife's role. So she played the good housefrau at home and the engineer at work. And when she was at work, she wasn't presenting herself as a female engineer. She was an engineer. She wore trouser suits. She wasn't showy about it, and she did face sexism, and she dealt with it sharply. So we've got one record of a man co-pilot being distracted by watching her skirt rise up as she's flying, and she deals with it. But that's not her main agenda.
Both women did not like each other. Why was that the case?
Oh, so many reasons. So Hannah and Melita, they knew each other before the war. They actually lived not that far apart from each other, where they grew up. They learnt to glide over the same green slopes before the war. And then in the 1930s, the sort of glamorous age of flight, they were part of this quite exclusive and elite circle of female aviators who were generally pretty supportive of each other. Incredible women like Ellie Beinhorn and Beate Earth. But no, Hannah and Melita absolutely loathed each other. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. I think that Hannah she shared the Nazi worldview. She was anti-Semitic deeply. And she at some point discovered that Melita had found out just before the war that her father had actually been born Jewish. So Melita was categorised by the Nazi regime as Mischling, or half-blooded, and she shouldn't have been flying anyhow as a woman. Absolutely extraordinary. She was so skilled that even as a woman considered part Jewish, she was still enabled to flourish in that role, because she was so able and they needed her. So Hannah, very unpleasantly, would talk about Melitta's racial burden. Now, how is Melissa going to respond to that? In any case, she feels, I'm sure she knew that Hannah was deeply racist. I'm sure that Hannah didn't hide that. We have several instances of people talking about their relationship, saying they wouldn't even deign to have a cup of tea with each other. I think that Melissa felt that Hannah was ill-educated. She had these appalling prejudices. And she wasn't an engineer, she wasn't an aeronautical engineer, she didn't really understand the planes that Melitta did, but she was doing extremely well in the regime because she was very good at networking with the senior Nazi leaders. So, I mean, clearly there's going to be a whole set of antagonisms there.
In the book, you described Melitta as having been neither an incorruptible saint nor a martyr. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yes. I think sometimes when we read things, my last book was about Christina Skarbek, aka Christine Granville, Britain's first female special agent at the Second World War. She was a Polish-born woman. She was absolutely extraordinary. She served in 3 different theatres of the war. She didn't have to serve in one as a woman, but she was parachuted behind enemy lines, and her achievements were a really significant contribution to the Allied war effort. Now, we're absolutely gunning for her. She's a total heroine. Yes, I mean, she had bad points, she had weaknesses, and I explore those in the book. It makes her more interesting. But we are totally on side with her. With Hannah and Melitta, it's tempting to think that they're purely the bad guys, or perhaps that I have a yin and yang, a goodie and a baddie in this story. And they're certainly at different sides of that spectrum, but they're not completely opposite ends of it. So they're not cartoon characters, they're real people. Biographies are about the truth of real people. And they struggled through times of dictatorship and war, which perverted the conditions of society in which they lived. And they made very different decisions. Neither of them were, clearly neither of them were in any way a saint or a martyr. Neither of them were at the opposite extreme either. But they were at different ends of that spectrum, somewhere between culpable and complicit, yes.
So how would you best describe the process by which Melitta got to a point where she supported a 1944 plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler?
Yes, well, Melitta, we don't know when exactly Melitta found out that her father had been born Jewish and had converted to Protestantism well before she was born. But it was certainly before the war, and she has a very different perspective on the rise of the Nazi regime from Hannah right from 1933 onwards. Hannah sees Adolf Hitler restoring jobs, providing affordable holidays and cars, social stability, fighting the communist threat, and so on. She thinks it's absolutely fantastic. They're this dynamic new regime. Melitta, where Hannah sees bunting and parades, Melitta sees the destruction of decent civil society. She sees the arrests of the Social Democrats, the union leaders, not just the communists. She sees violence on the streets, but state-sanctioned violence. So she is critical very early on from the regime. Of course, she does work for Nazi Germany. She's very significant in the development of the Stuka dive bomber, which had huge importance in the war. She's doing it partly as a patriot for an older Germany, a greater Germany than the Nazi regime. She's able to distinguish the regime from the country. And her country is at war, not just the regime. But she's doing it partly also to protect her family. So she is offered equal to Aryan status so that she can continue her work. And she actually refuses it unless it's given to all of her family. So she's kind of working under duress to some degree as well. Now, of course, she didn't know at this point what the horrific end of Nazi racial policy was. But she could see institutionalised racism. She could see violence on the streets with Kristallnacht. She could see the direction of travel. And so she is always wary. And by by 1944, she's married into this old German family, the von Stauffenberg family, which must have, she hoped, shored up her position as well. But her brother-in-law, who she's very close to, is Klaus von Stauffenberg, who led the most famous assassination attempt on Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, the 20th of July bomb plot in 1944. And one of the wonderful things I found during my research for this book was her handwritten 1943-1944 diary. And in that she records, and she's quite careful about it, obviously it's quite a dangerous document to have, so she uses people's initials and she uses pet names for people to try and protect them should the diary be lost or found. If you read that, I read it with the help of her family sort of translating it for me. It shows that she was meeting von Stauffenberg, his brother Berthold, who was also involved in the plot, and the other main conspirators, in the months and increasingly the weeks and days before the attack. She provides a safe place for them to meet. So because she's a pilot, she's given access to a yacht on the Wannsee Lake in Berlin, and that's somewhere where they can't be overheard or taped. And so that provides a secure meeting place for them to develop their plans. And she's increasingly staying over at Klaus and Berthold von Stauffenberg's Tristanstrasse flat in Berlin, which is sort of conspiracy HQ by July 1944. And so she's right there. And later she told a friend that she'd actually, she was meant to fly the plane to take Klaus into the Wolf's Lair for the assassination attempt, but she wasn't able to secure the right plane on the day. And so, she knew a little while beforehand that she wouldn't be able to undertake that. And so they went to Plan B and they had an adjutant fly them there. So she was very involved at the centre of that conspiracy.
By contrast to Melita, Hannah, as you briefly pointed out in your answer there, was far more enthusiastic about the Nazi regime.
Yes.
So
talk about that.
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to ask about after the regime fell, though. So
even then, yes.
Why was she enthusiastic about the regime, even 30 years after its fall?
Yes. When I was doing my book, obviously I looked at more recent books about Hannah, also her own memoirs and so on, and usually she seems to have been presented as apolitical, as someone who perhaps just wasn't interested in politics or didn't understand it. But actually I found various unpublished letters that confirmed that she was she shared that Nazi worldview. She was deeply anti-Semitic. She was racist. She was and one of the people I interviewed was Eric Winkle-Brown, who is brilliant. Well, sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was a brilliant pilot. He was with the Royal Navy as a naval pilot. He's also a test pilot. He's flown more different kinds of planes than anyone else in history. He's an absolutely remarkable man. And he knew Hannah before the war. They met at the 1936 Olympics. They met again in 1938 at the very end of the war. And they had a relationship, a professional relationship after the war as well. And he said to me that, he admired her flying skills, but he detested her politics. He said that she was a fanatical Nazi. And that is absolutely borne out by these letters I found in a private collection that have not been seen or published before, but previously, and in which she talks about horrendous stuff. She talks about the Holocaust industry and the Jewish lies about Holocaust, and it's incredibly offensive. It's extraordinary that some of these letters were written in the 1970s. So the evidence is there.
She was shown the evidence repeatedly in her life. So
yes.
Why did she deny the evidence right up until her death in 1979?
That's a good question. She was shown evidence actually during the war. A friend of Hannah and Melita's was a pilot called Peter Riedel, who's quite well known. He was a gliding world champion before the war. And he was an air attaché, first to America and later to Sweden in the war for the Nazi regime. And while he was in Sweden, that was the period when the Red Army is moving forward and they liberate the first of the concentration and extermination camps, which is called Majdanek, where horrendous numbers of people were killed in the gas chambers. I think they found 800,000 pairs of shoes there. And Photographs were taken and these were circulated. They took photographs of the camp, and they also took photographs of papers that had been discovered there that the Nazis who had pulled back had failed to destroy. And these included documents showing that Himmler had visited Maginot Camp and approved of the way it was being run. So these papers were somehow slipped to the Swedish, to the embassy where he was working. And he was horrified by them, horrified by he suddenly felt this surge of guilt, these rumours that he'd heard about, that he'd hoped were sort of one-off generals acting not under orders. Clearly, that wasn't the case. Clearly, this was regime-backed genocide. And he was absolutely appalled. And for some reason, when he's recalled back to Berlin, he decides to take these documents with him. I'm not quite sure what he was intending to do with them. But what he did do with them was, Hannah mentions they have having lunch. Actually, Peter met Melita in the morning and then goes for lunch with Hannah in the afternoon. And Hannah mentions how she's just, had some engagements with Himmler, and she praises him. And Peter Riedel is appalled because he's got these documents. So he gets them out and shows them to Hannah and says, look at this, give me your opinion now. And she screams at him. She cannot believe it. She refuses. I mean, she's quite violent in her yelling, this is Allied propaganda. How dare you believe it? And they fall out. Their relationship is never the same after that. She's also very abusive about Melita in that conversation. Anyhow, Peter says, well, if you don't believe it, if you're so sure, take them to Himmler, see what he has to say. And amazingly, Hannah Reich does that. I mean, it must be the only time it's the only time I've come across of one of the very senior Nazi leaders being challenged with photographs of one of the extermination camps. And she says, Himmler, can you explain this? And he looks at her and he doesn't answer her. He says, do you believe it? That's all he says. And she immediately leaps to take that as denial. So she said, absolutely not, it's just appalling propaganda, but I really recommend you do something about it so that people know this is not true. And once Himmler knows that she doesn't believe it, he doesn't have to get rid of her, that's fine. And they go on there, 10 minutes later, they're talking about crockery, his collection in his room and how he's decorated his apartment. So she is very keen to look the other way. She chooses to disbelieve, and she will take the slightest hint of denial as absolute truth. And I think she's harnessed her whole soul to this regime. It's her self-identity. If it turns out to be wrong, what does that make her? That makes her an appalling person who's helped to support this regime, which she has done. She cannot accept that, and she refuses to accept it. And so even after the end of the war, she refuses to take it on board. Now, perhaps when there was a process of denazification, Hannah actually is in a camp held by the Americans at that point, so perhaps she didn't go through that process quite as thoroughly as others. But by the 1970s, there is absolutely no excuse. And there are many opportunities where she could have done something positive at that point. She could perhaps have, when she writes her memoirs, she had opportunity then. She was presenting herself as a good example for the young people of Germany. And she could have said, at the time I didn't know what was going on, but looking back, I'm appalled that I was supporting this terrible regime we didn't know at the time. She could have done something, she could have spoken about it, but she never distanced herself. And she actually continued to wear the Iron Cross that Hitler had given her. And when she was, even in very late interviews, asked about whether she had regrets, she said that she was still a National Socialist and her only regret was that they had lost the war. So there is no question of where her opinion lay. Why? That's an impossible to answer, but I think maybe that gives you some picture of it.
What, if anything, do the legacies of both these women tell us about Nazi ideology, in your opinion?
Okay. Well, I think, in a nutshell, it shows us the hypocrisy of the Nazi regime. Here we have two women who are working in what was possibly considered certainly one of the most macho, masculine part of the Nazi forces, working in flight, being test pilots. They were the only two women doing it. And the Nazis would not have employed them in this role if they didn't feel they needed to. But they make an exception for women to undertake this work. Not only that, one of them, Melita von Stauffenberg, is labelled by the regime as Mischling, mixed blood, part Jewish. Her father had been born Jewish. And so they're prepared even to make an exception on their most fundamental principles. You know, they are a regime whose ideology is premised on biology. You know, that there is only, women have a certain sphere, you know, children, kitchen, the church, and they are controlled in different ways. That we have a young German girls' society and a fascist, you know, the German Women's League, but they're controlled in a very specific way. They're not allowed to have political function and so on, and they're certainly not allowed to be in the Luftwaffe. But they felt they needed these women, so they made exceptions for it. And the regime has no place at all for Jews, German Jews, Jews of other nationalities. They consider them to have no value. And yet, not only did they employ these women, they actually gave both of them highest honours. They both received the Iron Cross, and Hannah Reich was the only person to get the Iron Cross the only woman to get the Iron Cross first class in the war, and Melita von Stauffenberg got the Iron Cross second class, and she was nominated and approved to get the Iron Cross first class, but the bomb pot came in between, and after that, of course, she was imprisoned and not given the highest honours. But it shows you how the Nazi regime was quite prepared to be completely hypocritical according to their own standards.
In a review of your book for The Spectator, this claims that you deliberately set out to make readers uncomfortable about wanting to celebrate the achievements of both these women. Was that your intention?
Do I set out to make people uncomfortable in reading my books? Well, I want people to enjoy the books. I want them to have a good read. I want them to want to turn the pages. I also want people, hopefully, to learn. I mean, I learned an awful lot when I was doing my research for this. I think it is always good to make yourself slightly uncomfortable, to go outside your comfort zone. I think it's really important that we constantly revise our understanding of history, that we don't think, right, we've got that in a neat box, we understand that completely. There's always new perspectives, and I think that it's very important to take those on board and look at history from different angles. This story, a lot of it it's new because we're looking at two women in the Nazi regime. Hannah Reich is fairly well known, but Melita von Stauffenberg has kind of been left out of history altogether. And I think largely that's because she's a woman, and nobody expected her to be having that role. Nobody was seeking her out. But also it's partly because Hannah actively tried to keep her out of the history books. So it's fantastic to put it back in. But I don't, as I said earlier, I want it to be a book about real people who were very compromised, who made difficult choices. And one of them made appalling choices. And she, we can recognise she was a brilliant pilot. And she was absolutely very courageous. But Hannah Reich was a fanatical Nazi, and that needs to be remembered too. All of that needs that woman, the whole of her. And so, of course, that's difficult, and that should make people uncomfortable. I don't know if I deliberately went out to do it. Melita von Stauffenberg, she is involved in the most famous attempt to assassinate Hitler, but she is also compromised. She did a huge amount of valuable work for the Luftwaffe. And her work was of huge importance to the Nazi regime. So, yes, it's important that we look at these questions as complex, because they are.
You said in your answer there that Hannah attempted to keep Melita out of the history books.
Yes.
How and why? Okay,
when I was doing my research, I was very lucky. I managed to get in touch with a man called Gerhard Brack, who is a German author, and he's looked at Melita in Germany. And I went out and visited him, and he has got loads of papers and archive details. It's he that has Melita's diary. And I was talking to him, and I asked him if he knew much about Hannah as well. And he'd never had an interest in Hannah, except that when he was starting his research into Melita, he got in touch with Hannah. She was still alive then, this was in the 70s, and asked her if she had any memories that she could share for his biography. And he discovered that, she came back saying, absolutely not, there's nothing, there's no point. And then he was in touch with Melita's family. Her sister Clara had hoped to write a book about Melita, which was never done. Well, I suppose Gerhard took that on. And she had also got in touch with Hannah and had the same response. And she had kept Hannah's letters. And no one's looked at them because they were interested in Melita, not Hannah. But in those letters, she says how embarrassing it would be if this book was ever written, because Melita wasn't really a very skilled pilot. And she didn't really do anything of any value for the Nazi regime. And she even said that Melita's Iron Cross was not valid. And it was. Absolutely was. And she said that Melita was driven by this appalling ambition that was driven by her racial burden and her desire to make good on it. And just dreadful stuff. And eventually Clara, she didn't go ahead with her book. And it, so I think Hannah, maybe it was partly jealousy. I mean, that's normally people say to me, were they jealous? Perhaps Hannah was partly jealous because she wanted to be the flying darling of the Nazi regime. That was her role. But I think there's more to it than that, because I think that Hannah had always seen herself as a heroine. She thought she was on the side of the angels. She thought, the Nazi regime was where it was at. And if Melita was re-looked at and re-evaluated, and people started saying that Melita, who had tried to fight against that regime, if she was a heroine, what did that make Hannah? That would negate her life and her impression of herself. So I think she was very keen to keep that history hidden.
Do you think the fact you are a feminist impacted the way you wrote about these two women at all?
I am a feminist. I believe in equal opportunities for everybody. It's possible that I might not have come across them had I not been seeking to write about women. I have an interest in women in conflict. That's not all I'm interested in, but it is fascinating because in times of conflict, women have had new roles open up for them that they wouldn't necessarily have had before, both on the home front and on the front line or behind the front line as a special agent. So I think that's fascinating, and I have found that a lot of the work that's been done on women more, certainly special agents, tends to present them in rather romantic terms, quite a bit of focus on their appearance rather than their achievements. And so I thought it is important to try and give a more balanced view. And so I suppose that's how I came towards this story. I was looking at the roles of women in the war, so I was looking at the aerial photograph interpreters, and Constance Babington Smith. One of the nice ironies, at one point she would have been looking at photographs of Peenemünde. She was the person who found the V1s and V2s in the photographs for the first time, that identified Peenemünde on the Baltic coast as the Nazi proving ground or testing ground. And one of the dots on one of those photographs walking along to do the test work would have been Hannah Reich. So you had women on either side of a lens, either side of the war. That is a story that hasn't really been told. And I was originally going to write about Constance Babington Smith and Hannah Reich, but then I came across Melita's story and knew that they made such fantastic foils for each other. That was the story I had to tell. So yes, I guess it has brought that in. Certainly I'm aware of the importance of female stories, and I think that there is a rich seam of untold stories there that really, whether it's women's history, it's just history, but a new angle, a new perspective is good. It's always good.
I wanted to finish up by asking a hypothetical, yet somewhat topical question, which is this. If today, in a public square in Berlin, there legally existed statues of both Hannah Reich and Melita von Stauffenberg that were built for propaganda purposes by the Nazis, would you, as a historian, support their removal?
Firstly, they would never have built a statue to Melita von Stauffenberg. Had they been successful in the position to build statues to these women, I think by then they'd have got rid of Melita von Stauffenberg and erased her from the history books anyhow. I don't think they would want posterity to know that they had employed a woman who was part Jewish in such a significant role. Robert Harris's book Fatherland, which I love, fantastic book. Towards the end of it, because it's a dystopia in which the Nazis have won and is in the 1970s or something, in that parallel universe, and he mentions at Goering Airport there is the rust-pitted eyes in the statue of Hannah Reich. So yes, it's a lovely image, and I'm sure they would have erected a statue to her. He's absolutely right. However, if there were remnants of these statues that had somehow bizarrely still survived to this day, so you're asking about the big issue about taking down the statues. I think that I think that history is not, I don't want to whitewash the past. I want to understand the past, how it happened, because how else are we going to learn from history? We need to look at our sources. As any good history student knows, every text has a context. Every statue has the context in which it is erected. Now, the history isn't just the statue. It isn't the aims of the people who carved it and placed it. It's also what it tells us about their thought processes when they were deciding to put a statue to that person there. So I think it is important to have these statues, to keep them, not necessarily in the same situation, though perhaps depending, but perhaps, well, certainly, to have the context made clear. So perhaps if you've got amazing Nazi statuary behind glass in a museum, it's very important that etched on that piece of glass or projected onto it is the context explaining what was behind it, explaining the appalling ideology or what the intentions were with putting this forward. So I think you can be creative at the way that you look at the relics from the past. I don't think they should be destroyed. I think we should learn from them, but I don't think they should be necessarily venerated either. That's a very different thing.
Claire, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
One of our clients, bless him, the most important thing in his basket is toilet paper. How sad is that? That people look at toilet paper as such a basic necessity that they don't have themselves. And we take things like that very for granted.